Good morning. This is Beth Overmo at the State Bar of South Dakota. I'm the Strategic Plan Coordinator. Bringing you Law for Lunch today on farm financing and counseling clients. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You can ask questions of our panelists using the questions panel on the GoToWebinar dashboard. All participants are in listen-only mode, which means you will only be able to type out questions if you have that. So just keep that in mind. Or you can also attempt to email them to me at elizabeth.overmo@sdbar.net, and we will attempt to answer those at the end of the presentation. With that, I will turn it over to Stanton Anker, co-chair of the Continuing Legal Education Committee of the State Bar.
Thank you, Beth. This is Stanton Anker. I'd like to welcome everybody who's attending today's Law for Lunch on farm financing and counseling clients. We believe we have a very good presentation in store for you today with some very timely information that's affecting a lot of people in our state. I will quickly introduce our speakers today. We have Susan Stokes. Ms. Stokes was appointed to the position of Assistant Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, the MDA, in November 2016. Ms. Stokes brings a wealth of experience working with Minnesota farmers and farm organizations, having spent 14 years at the Farmers Legal Action Group in St. Paul, first as the legal director and then as the executive director. As Assistant Commissioner, Ms. Stokes currently oversees 3 of the MDA's regulatory divisions: pesticide and fertilizer management, dairy and meat inspection, and food and feed safety, as well as the agency's laboratory services. Another one of our presenters today is Meg Moynihan. She is a senior advisor at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. For many years, she's managed the MDA's organic program. She also has previously worked as a program director, educator, and evaluator, and served with the U.S. Peace Corps, Thailand. Ms. Moynihan owns and operates a diversified 70-cow organic dairy farm with her husband, Kevin Studeman. In 2016, the Studemans lost their milk market, and Meg took a leave of absence to run the farm single-handedly, experiencing the stress, anxiety, burnout, and depression common to many farmers. Jeff Peterson is a principal shareholder with Gray, Plant, Moody, a law firm with offices in Minneapolis, St. Cloud, Fargo, and Washington, D.C. He focuses his practice on commercial transactions, creditors' rights, bankruptcy, and agricultural and food law. Jeff has a background in agribusiness, having worked for Country Hedging, the commodity trading division of CHS, as a commodity branch manager and market analyst in Kansas City, where he advised clients on commodity hedging strategies and trading agricultural futures and options for grain and livestock producers and grain cooperatives in South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. He is a frequent speaker on agriculture and finance topics, is a former chair of the American Bar Association Agricultural and Agribusiness Financing Subcommittee, and is the current chair of GPM's Commercial Financial Services Practice Group. He grew up on a dairy farm in northwest Wisconsin as a graduate of the University of Kansas School of Law and received an LLM degree in agricultural law from the University of Arkansas. We also have with us today Claire Gary, an attorney in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who has a wealth of experience in farm and ranch reorganizations and bankruptcy law in South Dakota. He has practiced debtor-creditor law for over 40 years, with the last 30 years concentrating on business restructuring, and has done considerable amount of the farm and ranch restructuring. And with that, I give you our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Susan Stokes. I think I'm up first. And thank you, Stanton. I should add a little update. When we originally planned this webinar, I was at the Department of Agriculture. I have since moved on. I've gone back into private practice. And on our presentation, you can see I'm with the firm of Lynn, Jensen, Sullivan, and Peterson. We're in Minneapolis, and we have lawyers licensed in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. And I'm doing my ag law practice here. So thank you for inviting us. This is a webinar that Jeff and Meg and I did for Minnesota. I believe it was back in May. And we were asked to reprise it for South Dakota because I think there are a lot of similarities in the ag economy and in the things that all of us who practice in this area are seeing with our farm clients. And so I'm just going to start by doing a general overview of kind of the economy. And I'm looking out my window here in Minnesota, so this is where our focus has been. And as we know, the median farm income has really plummeted, and the statistics that came out earlier show that the 2018 median net income was just over $26,000, which is an all-time low since we started keeping track of this measure. It will surprise no one to hear that median dairy farm income was even lower than that at $14,697. And I don't know about South Dakota, but in Minnesota we have been losing dairy farms at a really, I find it a frightening rate. And so, in 2018, the bottom 20% of all producers lost $72,000. And across all farms, 34% lost money on farm operations in 2018. And I think what's most concerning to those of us across the industry, and we're seeing it if you're working with bankers, and in the work that Jeff does, is that so many producers have cut into their net worth. They've lost working capital. They're eating into their equity, or have eaten most of their equity. And if you could go to the next slide, this is just a graphic depiction of what our Commissioner of Ag says it's the fifth year of a 3-year downturn in agriculture, and it's just been hard for everyone, whether you're working with banks or whether you're working with producers or implement dealers or anyone, because this is it's just been as bleak as anyone can remember, and I don't think I'm telling anyone anything new on that front. The next slide does show the number of dairy farms that we've been losing in Minnesota, and these statistics were current as of May of 2019, and I used to, at the department, I oversaw the Dairy and Meat Inspection Division, so I don't have the most current numbers, but we went in Minnesota, we went from almost 3,500 dairy farms to about 2,700 in a matter of 4 years, and those tend to be, at the beginning, they were the very small farms, but in 2018 and 19, we were seeing losses across all categories of dairy farms. The next slide has a little bit of information about what the farm economy has been like in South Dakota. And, for those of you who are there, again, this is probably nothing new. I was a little surprised to see that. It was not a surprise to see the 67% decline in net income over the 6-year period between 2011 and 2017. 2017 net income was similar to what Minnesota's was in 2018, but the net income in 2018 did increase, and looks like it more than doubled. And I don't know if that was due to market facilitation program payments. I didn't really have a chance to dig into that number, and that might be something Claire would be able to speak to. But there's also this sort of decline in the number of farms that are still around in South Dakota. Between 85 and 2017, there was a loss of over 5,000 farms in the state. The next slide just shows the national economy, and that it just depicts the drop in the net farm income that's happened over the last 5 years. And I think that there are, if you go to the next slide, the farm cash receipts are forecast to go down in 2019, but I think that there is some there's some uptick that's happening because of the market facilitation payments. And so the second round is due to come out. So that is actually helping keep that graph from sliding down even further for 2019. I think most producers would say they'd rather have the markets, but that aid has been a help. So that's just setting the context for the work that we're all doing in this area. And then I think I'll just turn it over to Jeff for the next slide. He'll talk about some of the work that he's been doing.
Great, thanks, Susan. So again, this is Jeff Peterson, and what I'm going to be speaking to is what I see on a somewhat frequent basis, and it really started in the spring of 2018, and again in the spring of 2019, and what I expect we'll see in the early spring of 2020. And again, most people in the audience have probably seen this or is aware of this, but what's happening is as we approach 2020 and the operating needs, you get to November, December, these annual operating loans are up for renewal. And so lenders are having farmers come in, they're looking at their operational finances, and what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years has been that you would take operating losses and you'd roll those into the term debt secured by real estate. And so, they're kind of, to some extent, glossing over the operational issues on some of these, and most in farming operations, by looking to the real estate equity to secure that operating loss and rolling it into a term loan secured by real estate. And we're going to, I would imagine, see the same in 2020. Operating losses in 2020, the lender and borrower have to make a decision. Are we going to roll operating losses from 2019 into against the real estate? And I think that model has worked to some extent because real estate values are fairly strong still. And if we see real estate values soften, there's just going to be a greater push by the lending community not to do what has been done the last couple of years. And so really the issue becomes a situation where the farmer and the lender don't come to an agreement. The lender is not willing to finance the 2020 operating costs. And you're in a situation where you have a farmer that's going into the 2020 crop season, has no traditional financing, and you have a lender, what I'll call the 2019 lender, still has a security interest in the 2019 crop that's hopefully in the bin, and then would have a lien in the 2020 crop that would be planted. And so it puts the farmer in a real difficult situation as to obtaining traditional financing. And so there's really 4 options for that farmer. The first option is obviously some kind of negotiated agreement with its 2019 lender. And we see that's where a situation where they just subordinate to a new lender the 2020 crop. So the 2019 lender keeps the 2019 crop, and the 2020 lender gets the 2020 crop. But again, that requires the 2019 lender to agree to that. And depending on their collateral package, you may get a lender that is not real friendly to that because of concerns regarding recovery against its 2019 loan. Option 2 is only an option in Minnesota and states that have similar farmer lender mediation laws. In Minnesota, and I believe in Iowa, you can do this too. There's a mechanism under the Minnesota Farmer Lender Mediation Act, and I'm not going to go into detail about this, but effectively you can petition a state court to allow for the use of 2019 crop proceeds for necessary living and farm operating expenses. There were some unpublished decisions in 2019 as to what that means, but that's at least in Minnesota an option. The third one is use of agricultural liens. So again, you have a 2019 lender that has a lien in the 2020 crop, and so you see farmers going out into the marketplace and obtaining crop inputs supplies through the Cenex Harvest States of the world, or Cenexes of the world, and other crop input suppliers that are willing to do it on credit. And in many states, including in Minnesota, those creditors, those vendors, can obtain a super priority ag lien so that they make sure they get paid first out of the 2020 crop. South Dakota, as this audience is aware, has a landlord, a seed supplier, and a harvester lien, but they don't have a general ag inputs lien. So that leaves a gap. So as that farmer goes into 2020, he may be able to obtain financing for rent, or you may have a landlord that's willing to allow the ground to be leased in 2020 because the landlord can rely on a priority ag lien. The seed supplier and then ultimately the harvester would have some relief. But for fertilizer, fuel, and other ag inputs, those vendors don't have that ability. And so now it's the difficulty of that farmer finding some either alternative financing on a subordinate basis that would come in with a junior lien. Typically that may be through a family member or someone, some related party. But that's not an easy thing to do and can be a hard thing to do in a state like South Dakota where you don't have a general ag input lien. And then finally, the fourth one is filing bankruptcy. And the filing of the bankruptcy would allow under 552 of the bankruptcy code, you can sever the lien, the 2019 lien in the 2020 crop. So by using the bankruptcy code, you can sever that Article 9 security interest as to the 2020 crop, depending on the date of the filing of the bankruptcy. And so what typically happens is they work down this list, right? So you start with a negotiation, that doesn't go anywhere. At least in Minnesota and Iowa, you look at mediation, that doesn't go anywhere. Then you look at ag liens and finding alternative financing. If that doesn't go anywhere, then you're really left with bankruptcy and either filing a Chapter 11 or Chapter 12. So what as you work down this list, what you typically happen is, and I expect to happen in 2020, is you're going to see these ag bankruptcy filings for crop farmers in January, February, March, maybe April, because they're in a situation where they're desperate and they need to use the 2019 crop to put in the 2020 crop. And so that's the kind of the storyline we've seen over the last couple of years. And I think in this current farm economy, you're going to see it more in early 2020 with Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings. Susan, I was going to go back to you on the farmer-lender mediation.
Right. So once you get to that point, and there are producers that are facing rising debt that's been secured by the farm or by the real estate, and they get into a situation where they're falling behind. And again, this is the scenario that Jeff's been talking about, and that you all, I'm sure, are seeing as well. And so in Minnesota, we have a farmer-lender mediation program, and many states have them. So 41 states have them, and they're run within each state, and each state does it differently. And FSA gives grants to help run those programs, and then some states supplement with their own budgets. And we're lucky enough to have on the phone Claire. Is it Jerry? Is that how you say your last name?
Yes.
So the next page has just the basic outlines of the South Dakota Farmer-Lender Mediation Program. And although we have lawyers here who are licensed in South Dakota, I'm personally not experienced in Farmer-Lender Mediation in South Dakota. I have more experience in Minnesota. So we're happy that Claire is able to speak a little bit to his experience with Farmer-Lender Mediation in South Dakota.
Yes, thank you.
If you could go to the next slide too, please, that would be great.
All right, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, South Dakota does have mandatory ag mediation. Before any action could be commenced to enforce an ag-related debt of $50,000 or more, there must be an ag mediation release before any type of action. If you're looking at a security interest even before a repossession action can begin, there is mandatory mediation, and a release is mandated before that can proceed. Unfortunately, this is an affirmative defense under Walsh versus Larson, 2005, South Dakota 104, where if the debtor doesn't respond to any type of complaint or repo with an affirmative defense that mediation has not been waived, it will automatically be waived because it's an affirmative defense. There is a process that allows a creditor to shorten the mediation process if there's, after a notice and a hearing, if there's any issue of allegations for irreparable harm. But I've never seen that. That's very rare. There is automatic release of mediation if a bankruptcy is dismissed, or if the bankruptcy court abandons the property, or a creditor obtains relief from stay. So during the mediation process, that's not necessary if the debtor just quickly files a Chapter 12 or Chapter 11 proceeding. It will be automatically waived. But the mediation process in South Dakota, it's very short term. The initial mediation must take place within 21 days after the Ag Department sends out notice of mediation. It must be completed within 42 days, unless, of course, the creditor consents to a continuance, which happens probably more often than not. Mediation, if a creditor fails to appear for mediation, there is an automatic, there's never a release until appearance is processed. But if a debtor and a spouse don't appear, there is an automatic release. And mediation cannot be waived by a debtor prior to 60 days before any collection activity. So in other words, you can't waive the mediation process in any loan documents, which is the best protection. While mediation is confidential and privileged, this is pretty strictly enforced. As a practical matter, in South Dakota, I always encourage clients to accept and take part in mediation. One of the primary reasons for that is there is an ag financial counselor available at no cost to debtor. They'll come to the debtor's facility, into their home, sit at the kitchen table, and spend a few hours with them going over financials, assisting in preparing a balance sheet, income statement, making those in a more user-friendly form for creditors to understand, and basically discuss the operations and give some assistance on should there be some changes perhaps in the operations. I always encourage not only mediation be applied and partaken in, but in particular that the debtor, even sophisticated debtors, but most of the time just the family farms, can definitely use help on ag financing. Another important reason for the taking part in the mediation is it's inexpensive. A debtor pays $100, and same with a creditor, $100 for the first hour of mediation, and then only $25 for every hour thereafter. And it's been my experience that these usually take 2 to 4 hours, depending upon how productive they are. But during that process, it's basically free discovery for a debtor. You kind of figure out where the bank has major issues, where the bank's concerns are. If at the end you could even look at prepackaging a Chapter 12 or Chapter 11, find out exactly what heartburn the bank or the lender gets on any particular subject. If you're just looking at a repo on a piece of equipment, pretty simple mediation on extending terms and working out adequate protection type payments. As a general knowledge, well, I've got ag people on the line, I do want to make sure everyone's aware that recently the limitations for Chapter 12 have increased. Up until recently, the limit was just over $4 million for total ag debt. Now that's been increased to over $10 million, which is just a huge advantage. Another important, just general knowledge, I find a lot of creditor bank attorneys and stuff really haven't taken this into consideration. But back in 2017, there was a revamp of the tax law for Chapter 12 purposes only under 11 U.S.C. Section 1232, which basically turns capital gains tax for a Chapter 12 into a non-priority tax. So you basically treat capital gain consequences as a credit card debt. You pay it pennies on the dollars, and that's if the capital gains were incurred farm related prior to, during, or even after the Chapter 12 filings. Just found frequently, even through a mediation, when the settlement is acceptable between all parties, it still takes a Chapter 12 proceeding to deal with some of the tax consequences if there's partial liquidation, especially in land. So I wanted to point out those two general knowledge issues. And other than that, farm mediation, unfortunately, doesn't have the same protections in South Dakota as it does in Minnesota as far as providing for crop financing or anything like that, but it's a fast process, and success is determined in several different ways, not necessarily a completion of an agreement between the parties, but success in assisting in necessary restructuring Chapter 11, Chapter 12, if it gets to that point. Those are kind of my general comments.
Great, thank you. That's really useful, and I can just walk through Minnesota's process if we can move to the next slide. So there are similarities between the state programs, but also some differences. So our program was created in '86, during the height of the farm credit crisis of the '80s, and it sounds like South Dakota, it's not waivable in loan documents or any other contract prior to going in. And it's mandatory. So any creditor who wants to take steps to enforce a debt that's been secured by ag property has to offer farmer lender mediation. And so what happens is a notice goes out to the debtor, and the debtor doesn't have to accept, and sometimes they don't because it's timing. It's one creditor. It's just not their major creditor that they're trying to deal with at the time, so they're not quite ready. But in 2018, you can see the statistics. It's a pretty heavily used program. A little over 1,200 farmers did accept the notices, and there were 33,000 contracts involved in there, and 84%, I think, is a pretty significant number of those 1,220 farmers that went into the farmer lender mediation process, reached agreement with their creditors. And it's important to note that once the creditors receive notice, and regardless of whether they participate in the mediation, if a settlement agreement is reached at the mediation, all creditors are bound by it. They have an opportunity to object to it, but there's a strong incentive for creditors to participate in the mediation process. The next slide, it just is the definition of agricultural property under the statute. So it's real property and personal property that's used as security to finance the farm operation. And the eligibility requirements, you have to own or lease more than 60 acres. The debt threshold was raised just a couple of years ago. It used to be 5,000, and now it's 15,000. And then, you have to be a farmer or an authorized family farm corporation under our corporate farm law 500.24. The next slide is, the process of how it works. So the creditor sends the notice, and then the debtor has to request the mediation. They have to do it within 14 days of receiving the notice. The statute says it has to be by certified mail or another method of requiring receipt. The program officer, the woman who runs the program, says that they'll accept it, by email, fax, or you can just drop it off in person. We've had the same person running the program, and it's run. It often has gone back and forth between it being through Extension or being through the Department of Ag, but the same person has run it since it was started, and she's done an amazing job of it. And like South Dakota, farmers who go through the process, they are offered the services of a free financial counselor who can help them walk through their financials and get them ready for the mediation, and that is a really valuable service. And when the farmer gets that notice of mediation, they have to list all the known creditors and unsecured creditors. And they also, a recent addition or change to the laws is they have to sign a permission to have a credit report run. That used to slow things down in the past, and it just kind of moves things along more quickly if a credit report can be done by the time of the mediation. And then all creditor actions are suspended for 90 days after the debtor files the mediation request. And so, it's not an overstatement to say that this program has saved thousands of Minnesota farms from going under. And I think we have one of the more robust programs in the country. And with that, I will turn it over to Meg.
The color commentator. And my role here, if we could go to the next slide, is to help you think more about why you may be encountering farmers and ranchers who have increased stress levels, and also help you think about your interactions with them. Please go to the next slide. Stanton talked a little bit about my background in the introduction, but I just want to give you my bona fides and stress that I am not a mental health professional. I am a human being, and so, like you, am a person who has varying degrees of mental health on different days. I grew up as a city person. And although I've worked most of my professional life in agriculture, I did not become a farmer until 2012, when I married this goofy-looking guy who is a dairy farmer and became more involved in the farming operation. And things were swimming along well. I was one of those spouses that work off the farm and help, in between the cracks. I was working full-time at the Department of Agriculture in St. Paul, running the organic program. And then all of a sudden, let's go to the next slide. In 2016, we got a very disturbing piece of news on March 1st from our organic dairy cooperative, which said, we are eliminating your route. We no longer will be picking up your milk in 30 days. Good luck. And that is about all it said. So 30 days came and went. In the meantime, I very smugly thought, well, I'm the organic lady. All I have to do is make a few calls. I know everybody in organic production and processing. This can't be hard. And it was impossible. I called and called, and every organic milk buyer had plenty of organic milk. They were not interested in our little 70 cows worth. And this was really devastating. After 30 days, we started emptying the bulk tank. That's the picture that you see there on the left, with a pump, and we are dumping 1,000 gallons of fresh, pure, grade A organic milk out and sucking it through a hose and into that big holding tank. Some of it went down the road to a conventional neighbor that fed it to his hogs, and a lot of it just was dumped. And this went on for several months. And pretty quickly, my husband hit an emotional wall and said, I've been busting my ass for this farm for so long, and it is clear that I have failed. I am a failure as a farmer. I quit. I'm done. I am going to an industry where I'm valued. I am going to become an over-the-road furniture mover. And I'm done. I love you, and I want to stay married to you, but I can't do this anymore. And so then I was stuck in the position of, oh my God, what do we do? This is a farm that my husband founded. I married into it to be his partner. I take that really seriously. I have seen other farmers make decisions when a crisis has hit that they have then regretted. And I thought, my God, what do we do? And so what I ended up doing is taking a leave of absence from the Department of Agriculture for 8 months and running that farm myself, and pretty much doing everything. So I went from living on a farm to being a farmer. And that brought me into contact with my neighbors, with other farmers in the neighborhood, and with my own self in terms of anxiety, stress, and some other issues that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So that gives you a little picture of why I I am here talking about farm stress issues. I did eventually, our problem was resolved. We found another organic dairy co-op who would take the milk in December of that year. And I went back to work for the department, but just part-time. And based on my experience and my going back and saying, you people have no idea how bad things are getting out there, the leadership here said, help us figure out what it is that we can do to support farmers in stress. And so I've been doing that ever since. So that is now my role at the Department of Agriculture. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about your role vis-a-vis clients in stress. And this is kind of two things that I'm asking you to think about. There's what you can do, and then there's what you want to do or what you're comfortable doing. And those might not necessarily be the same thing. It might depend on your firm's perspective, and that is perfectly valid. But I want to talk about the options so that you can make decisions for yourself about the interactions with your clients and kind of plan ahead for that. Let's go to the next slide. And so here are some of the considerations. And I kind of want to talk about, before we talk about why farmers are encountering so much more stress now, and we will, I want to talk about some considerations for you to keep in the back of your mind. And one of these is, in an interaction with a client, how much of it is your legal counsel versus the client simply unburdening him or herself. And I bring this up because meeting with you, a trusted professional advisor in a confidential setting, may be the prompt that really gets them to open up about issues that are specific to why they are seeing you, but also some ancillary issues that are feeding into that. I bring that up just based on another personal experience. My husband and I went in to do wills, and when I got the bill and I took a look at the number of hours, I was just floored. And I thought, this is because my husband yaks and he just goes off on tangents and he sucked up our attorney's time. And of course we were charged for that. I certainly didn't have any problem with that, but I never had thought ahead for that. And so a lot of what we talked about was just stuff that had nothing to do with our estates or anything like that. So I bring that up because sometimes it may be something more serious than planning for that eventuality. There may be other issues going on in their lives. So if you think about and come to some agreement, again, with the guidance from your firm, if that's relevant, of, how much time can the client, can be sucked up by the client, the pleasantries, maybe some client unburdening versus legal counsel, and how do you make a decision about that? And be very clear with the client about what the cost of your time is. A lot of the issues that farmers are dealing with right now that are pushing them to the edge are financial. And I think the last thing you want to do is inadvertently add to the client's stress by blindsiding them with expenses that they really weren't anticipating. Another thing that I would encourage you to think about is, how can you help them maximize their investment? Can you suggest, for example, that they bring a friend, a spouse, a note taker, so that if they are in an emotional state and maybe cognitively not functioning at par, can have somebody there who will take notes and help them reconstruct the conversation, things that they need to do after the consultation, what the next steps are. So that may be something that you can do. And another thing that you can do that's super helpful when farmers are in stress and scattered and trying to keep so many balls in the air is work with your office staff to provide just simple appointment reminders. That would be so helpful. Just, we have you down to come in on this date at this time. Here are the things that we need you to bring. Going back to that, how do we maximize their investment of time spent with you? So those are some things. Another that comes to mind that is not on this list is many practices have a newsletter, a client newsletter. And how could you use that to go over some of the issues perhaps that Jeffrey was outlining in his presentation about what is coming down the pike, some preparing farmers to think in lay terms, hopefully, about some of the some of what is coming, perhaps for themselves, perhaps for their neighbors, and prepare for that so they have a better idea and grounding in what their options, their legal options are. Let's go on. And we've already talked in detail, Susan talked about the financial stresses that farmers are under. I love this slide, and I just want you to know that it is in your packet because it gives you a snapshot of USDA data for the entire country, comparing the net farm income from the good times, which were the most recent good times, 2011, 2012, 2013, to what we have been experiencing recently. And the darker the color is the greater the drop in net farm income. So you guys, quite frankly, are doing a little better than our farmers in Minnesota, but that's not saying much at, a 65% drop versus a 76% drop. But this also shows you that these challenges are really universal. And as Susan said, what we're talking about happening in Minnesota is definitely happening across the border. I know for a fact that it's happening in North Dakota. I hear from people all over the country who are really frustrated about how is it that we help farmers when there seem to be no solution sometimes. Next slide. So the economic challenges, the financial challenges, I think are precipitating a great deal of the anxiety and stress and desperation that many farmers and ranchers are experiencing. But I want to ask you to peel that back and look underneath at some of the other issues that face farmers on a day-to-day basis. And you see kind of this tangle on the screen of challenges that farmers face regularly that they really have very little control over. And there becomes this personal, just human tension of the deep sense of responsibility that farmers have to make things work and to honor their forebears who established these farms, God knows how many years ago, their families, their communities, their land, their livestock, and really do right by all of those entities. And yet they are dealing with these astronomical health insurance bills. They are in competition for rental ground with their neighbors. They are experiencing a lot of stress from regulation from, for example, agencies like mine. We contribute to a lot of farm stress. Weather, we have seen that year after year, the weather fluctuating and exacerbating. You hear a great deal about what's happening with export markets and prices. And all of these things are challenges on a daily basis. And then when you add the low prices, the 5 years and the 3-year downturn, as Susan mentioned, it really becomes untenable for a lot of people. Let's go to the next slide. So what is so hard about farming? And I imagine that many of you are from farming backgrounds, some aren't. I'm sorry the slide got a little wonky when we translated it into a different format, but I think you can catch this. That triangle kind of speaks to the responsibility and control tension on the last slide, but I would posit that there are sets of circumstances that individually farmers encounter that when you take them together, they add up to an experience that is really quite unique and challenging. Maybe the first one is that farmers work where they live. There is no, let's go back to the slide before. There is no going home most of the time, and your successes and your failures are all around you, and there is a great temptation to work harder, work more hours, dig yourself out of the hole, and it's all right there, right outside your window, even if you're in the house. Another challenge is that your coworkers are often mostly family. And for some families, and you know who you are, this is marvelous. And it's a very, it's a very cohesive, unified approach. But there are some family members that don't get along. There are some families that have rifts and difficulties and challenges. And these are the people you were dealt in life. You are family with them. You are in business with them. You love them, but sometimes they could be real shysters. And there's not a lot sometimes that you can do about that, particularly if you're if you are a child, and mom and dad are still in control and assuming that all the kids are going to be working together and in synchrony, and that is often not the case. And I know a pastor who said, we have a farm family, and I sure wish that some of them would go to another parish and some of them would come here, because it's really hard having them all in the same church. Multiple roles. I mentioned that, my husband and I both work off the farm now, and that is more and more true for farmers and ranchers, that not just one adult is working off the farm, but frequently two adults are working off the farm. And so then there's this tension of, I need to do a great job in my farming and ranching, but I also owe the best of myself to my employer, who's paying my health insurance, paying me a salary or an hourly wage that is allowing me to continue to indulge my farm. Competition and envy. This may be something that you deal with perhaps more than these other issues. Frequently, farmers are not very nice to each other. And it seems ironic to me that as the number of farms decreases on the landscape, somehow the competition neighbor to neighbor seems to be accelerating in some places. And there can be competition over reputation, over land, over fence lines, over markets. And you would think with fewer of us, we would say, hey, we're all in this together, let's cooperate. But it seems like we are panicking over a pie that seems to be getting smaller. And so sometimes rural people are not, the apple-cheeked, oh, let's all get together and drink cider and do our harvest together with our pitchforks. It's let's stab each other in the back with our pitchfork. So that may be something that you're not a stranger to. This loss of peers and community, I mentioned the isolation. I have a friend in Southwest Minnesota who said, when we moved to our farm in 1977, I had 13 neighbor families that I could see from my kitchen window, and now there are 2. And all of the land is still being in corn and soybeans and now wind generators, but the people are gone. And so it is easier and easier to have, I shouldn't say it's easier, it is more likely that you don't have peers around you who are going through the same challenges in life and patterns that you are. Praise and blame. I think sometimes farmers don't know whether they're coming and going. Consumers love them and hold them on a pedestal. They're great. They're the yeoman farmer. They're the original small business person, the backbone of America. But, they pollute groundwater and they're mean to their animals and they're all rich and they have golf carts and, estates in Arizona. So sometimes you just are sort of like, would you be consistent with the message? I don't know if you love me or hate me, and I'm getting exhausted trying to figure it out. Next. So what happens in stress and these multiple challenges, I'm not going to read through this whole slide, but a lot of physical, emotional, mental challenges. And the upshot is that frequently cognitive function suffers. And we get to this point of paralysis or inability to make decisions, to get off the couch, sometimes to provide basic care for livestock in really extreme conditions. And so you may have clients who are extremely bright farmers and business people who come in that if they have been going through stress issues for a long time, just are cognitively not firing on all cylinders. And so I guess I would ask you to suspend your disbelief about what they bring to the table and really work with them and understand that some of that may be coming from these other contributing factors. The next slide is just some things to chew on that I included because I knew you were getting this handout of key messages that I think are supportive and that I have seen work and have had feedback that they're important things for farmers to hear. And maybe one of the first is, you are not alone. A lot of farmers feel very ashamed about what is happening to them. They may hear in the back of their head that other farmers are struggling, but really not believe that and think, I'm sure everybody's doing well except for me. And why is this something that I can't get a handle on? And so conveying your appreciation, your respect, and helping them understand that without breaching any confidences, that you know very well that they are not alone, that there are a lot of farmers in the same boat. And not only are they not alone in what they're experiencing, but they're not alone in having to navigate all of these challenges by yourself. And that goes to the next slide, I believe, which is having some resources. We don't expect, no one expects you to be a mental health counselor or a social services provider or a physician, but it can help you to know what resources are available. So if you do find a farmer in distress sitting across the table from you, you have something to offer him or her. And I have summarized some of the national resources and some of the South Dakota resources that I found on this slide. But I would say do a little snooping around, or if you have an intern or a paralegal who has some extra time, put together some resources that are unique to your area and think about places that you could encourage farmers to look for help. Because like I say, you are a trusted advisor. And there's a great deal of credibility. They're going to listen to what you say. And if you say, if you're, I understand that you're not sleeping very well. This might be something that, if I could be so bold, I'd suggest that you go and talk to your doctor about this, because there could be reasons. That might actually get them to go to their doctor. When I got to my doctor, I was put that summer when I was going through the running the farm by myself. I was put on antidepressants, which made a huge difference, and I stopped bursting into tears and slamming gates and yelling at the cows all the time. So, sometimes we need a physician, sometimes we need a mental health provider, sometimes it might be a clergy person, sometimes it might be just talking to your veterinarian or your attorney. So everybody needs something a little different, and if you have a little smattering, it may help you get people to where they need to go more directly, I would say. And so my last slide just brings us back to the beginning, is really encouraging you to think more about what you believe and feel that your role can and should be if you encounter clients in stress, being clear about that with yourself, being clear about that with your practice, and being clear about that with your clients. And with that, I was watching the House hearing this morning on the whistleblower. I will say I cede the balance of my time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking, I don't see where we have any questions in the queue right now, but we do have, we received an email from Kristen Edwards, attorney with the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission, and she'd like us to mention something to all our attorneys out there. If any of you have a client who is having trouble getting payment from an elevator, you need to have them call the Public Utilities Commission and let them know. This crisis is inevitably going to trickle to the elevators, and if the PUC knows early enough that one of them is in trouble, they can help to right the ship and get the farmers paid. So please, if any of you have a client who's having problems getting paid by an elevator, you're being encouraged to have them call the PUC Grain Division to let them know. Again, I don't see any other questions in the queue right now. Beth, if there's nothing else, I think that probably handles our Law for Lunch today. Again, I'd like to thank everyone who attended. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today.
Sounds great. Thanks, Stanton. And with that, we will conclude today's Law for Lunch. Thank you all for attending. This webinar was recorded and will be available on the State Bar of South Dakota YouTube channel within the week. Have a great rest of the week.